So what Plato is saying in this analogy is that the people in the cave that don't know anything else but looking at the shadows on the wall, but they don't know that, that's analogous to the physical world. And the guy outside of the cave, you see out in sort of the open air, that's analogous to somebody or humanity connecting with the forms out there in the ether, in this case, sort of the open air. And Plato believed that the more real of the two worlds, actually, and the more important, of course, was the realm of the forms out there where the guy is. And the fact that in the analogy, the people are, at the wall, don't know anything else, is again analogous to much of humanity being ignorant of any sort of world of thought and deep philosophical reflection that Plato believes is required to understand things that are permanent and unchanging and true about the world. All those sort of capitals, what's true, what's fixed, or the fixed true principles of justice and love and truth and honor, etc. So that the average person is, in a sense, the one that's chained up against the wall, and their everyday physical reality, which that is their everyday physical reality right there, but they think that's the only reality. They don't know that there's this whole other world behind and above them that's bigger and more important, and only a guy like Plato, you can picture sort of that's Plato standing up above everybody else outside, the handful of philosophers who are able to sort of get a grip on the forms by deep contemplation and serious philosophical thought. Socrates, Plato, right? Socrates was Plato's teacher and mentor, and in turn, Plato was Aristotle's teacher and mentor. So there's a relationship between all three of them. I should note that, let's go back, Plato, his most famous dialogue, The Republic, is in part a diatribe against democracy. Plato came from a wealthy Athenian family, kind of a noble family, and if you look at his sort of dates of birth and death there, he lived just after the Golden Age, and basically just after the collapse of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. So he was living in a time when the Golden Age of Greek democracy had gone by, wasn't what it used to be, but because he came from a noble family, he was probably less likely to be enamored of democracy in the first place. The Greek aristocrats and nobles, going back to Solon, and we talked about before, some of them were supporters of democracy, maybe reluctantly in some cases, but clearly there must have been nobles that were not. And we do know that Plato was not, because he wrote about it. He believed that the best type of government came with top-down rule from a king, but as Plato called him, the philosopher king, meaning that a good political system would have a top-down structure, not allowing people to vote, but having one person in charge and in command, but that person needs to be of a philosophical bent, needs to be able to get sort of in touch with the forms and understand truth, justice, beauty, right, in their pure, permanent, unchanging terms. And so if you have a philosopher king, you have a combination of the best characteristics possible for a good government. So he wasn't a believer in democracy at all. His pupil, brilliant, gifted pupil, didn't believe that, though he didn't support democracy per se either. And Aristotle didn't come from Athens, but he gravitated there as so many philosophical types, intellectuals did, because that was the place where you could sort of make the most of your career. But Aristotle famously tutored the young Alexander the Great, because he was from northern Greece, Macedonia, and Alexander, the son of a king, a prince, the king of Macedonia, right, got the best teacher available. Wouldn't be bad to have Aristotle as your teacher as a kid, but that's the type of education that was available to Alexander the Great. And when Aristotle came of age and came into his own as a thinker and philosopher, established his own school, so he had a career similar to his mentors, and Plato wasn't always magnanimous about the fact that the former pupil has now become an equal to, maybe even surpassed the teacher. He said one time, Plato, talking about Aristotle, metaphorically calling him the foal that kicks the mare. Right? The foal is a baby horse, the mare is the mother horse. So he's basically saying Aristotle, is like a young horse kicking one of his parents, me. So he's showing me disrespect, I guess, by being too brilliant. Plato founded something called the Academy in Athens, and Aristotle the Lyceum, kind of the ancient equivalent of universities, though there weren't dorms and buildings and classrooms. Much of the lecturing took place out of doors. Sometimes Aristotle is known as the peripatetic philosopher, which is just a fancy name for walking, because often when he lectured, he would just sort of walk around the grounds of the Lyceum, and the trees and plants and flowers, and his students would follow him around. I'm sure all of you would like that much better. It'd just be harder to do PowerPoint that way. And we certainly couldn't do that right now. We'd get in trouble. So, at any rate, if Aristotle had never existed, Anthony Gottlieb said, it would be pointless to try to invent him. Nobody could believe there could have been such a man. His surviving works run to almost 500,000 words. Reason to think this is no more than a quarter of what he wrote, actually. He wrote books dealing with ethics, political theory, rhetoric, poetry, constitutional theory, theology, meteorology, astronomy, physics, chemistry, scientific method, anatomy, mathematics, language, formal logic, and on and on and on. So this person's brilliance is a jewel, a shining light, and we can, I think, get historical figures of brilliance, wrong, because we all know more than Aristotle did. All of us today know more. But of course, we have the advantage of a couple thousand extra years of history and experience and learning, and the acceleration and compounding of learning, which he didn't have. So if we look back at many of his theories, many of his ideas, many of his claims, truth claims, they were wrong. He was wrong about, for instance, to give you one simple example, about the number of continents that existed in the world. He didn't have world travel yet then, but he had estimated there were 5 continents. He ended up being off by 2, which is a lot. When there's 7 continents and you're off by 2, that's a lot. But that doesn't mean he wasn't a genius. The fact that he didn't know how many continents there were had nothing to do with his mental ability, and it's clear if you read him. He's very hard to read, by the way, in a way that Plato is not. Plato's dialogues are still readable today. I mean, you can read both of them, but Plato's can still be read for pleasure. He deals with philosophical issues in a pretty down-to-earth way. It's pretty amazing to be able to say that someone that lived a couple thousand years ago who wrote something, we can read it and still be entertained by it. It still flows. Aristotle's works are a lot more dense and harder to read, and much more dry. And we're not exactly sure how they were composed. There is some belief that most, all of them were actually not written by him, but written by his students who took notes and then sort of wrote them down, kept the notes, organized them, etc. It might have been a combination of those things. Nonetheless, in his teachings, clearly in his even surviving works, he covers an astounding array of subjects. And as astounding as it is, and it certainly is that. We have to keep in mind that long ago, there wasn't nearly as much, or I mean, hardly any specialization compared to today. So nobody could be an expert on all those subjects today. Nobody. But there was so much less known about rhetoric and poetry and constitutional history and theology and meteorology, on and on and on, that it was at least possible to be an expert on all those subjects, although hardly anyone was. So I always sort of say it like this. It would be as if you're in your first day of college, you go to your physics class, and okay, the teacher says in my schedule here, Aristotle. Okay, there he is. He's got a beard and kind of long hair up at the whiteboard. Okay, and then you sort of listen to his spiel on the first day, and then you go to your history class, and wait a minute, that's the same guy. Aristotle teaches the physics class and history. Yeah. And then you stay for that class, go down the hall, out the door, under the next building for your astronomy class. And who's teaching that? Aristotle. He teaches everything, which in a sense was true. Aristotle is known for a great deal of contributions to Western thought and philosophy. Among them, his contributions to logic. He wasn't the only contributor to logic that's important in Western history, but one of them. His syllogisms are still used even today. They're sort of core fundamentals for thinking effectively. I took a critical thinking class in college, basic undergraduate class, and we had to study Aristotle's syllogisms. And as old as I am, I studied that in a class long after Aristotle was dead. I hope you know. So the syllogisms are others have been done, but he sort of broke them down into patterns, modus ponens and modus tollens, and showed which types of arrangements of logic are logically valid, and which ones are invalid. And it's amazing when you do this. We had an assignment where we had to go look at the newspaper or magazines for like a week or a month straight, I forget, and try to find arguments find these logical patterns in newspapers and in the media. And it's amazing how many you can find that are actually in the category of they're not logically valid. That the person, and these are oftentimes very educated, very bright journalists and writers, and intellectuals who are making, or so I found, the rest of the class did too, these logical mistakes without realizing it in article after article and piece after piece. So these things can still be used today. The most famous syllogism, and the syllogisms are usually said in this kind of form. So, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. So the idea is that if both of the premises are true, then the conclusion is airtight. It's irrefutable. And so this contribution to logic, with that one simple pattern, but there are others as well, that one's valid, has had tremendous impact on Western thought in the Western world. Because it is true. If all men are mortal, and Socrates was a man, then Socrates was mortal. There's no getting around that. So valid and invalid arguments in what are still known as syllogisms. And Aristotle departed from Plato, his mentor, in many ways, especially in his capacity and propensity to investigate the world and investigate nature from an inductive perspective, by examining evidence, by going out into the world and gathering evidence and data and information, coming back, analyzing it, and then drawing general conclusions about it. For instance, he had students go out, fan out across the Greek world, and bring back all kinds of information on different types of government in different city-states. And he used that to write his famous Politics and About Politics. In other works, the information was crucial. So he wasn't just using logic on his own or on its own, and he was also a believer in empirical evidence, gathering evidence. And this was the main sticking point, really, between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle, and maybe why Plato eventually came to say that Aristotle was the fool that kicked the mare, because if you can sort of boil it down to something, a simple way to say it, as we might today, surely he didn't say it this way, but Aristotle came to think about Plato's theory of forms, which he was clearly tutored in, since he was the star pupil of Plato, and the theory of forms was Plato's primary sort of philosophical, idea. But he came to ask, well, how do we know? How can we prove that the forms are even out there? Okay, you say they are. It makes sense that things like truth and justice, would have some sort of fixed reality. There's a fixed definition of them. Justice is this, and it's not that, and etc. But how can we actually prove it? And we can't prove it. Therefore, we can't say that it's true with any real confidence. We could speculate about it, but not be sure that we're right. So he had a much more empirical bent to him. Though he contributed greatly to logic, as we've already seen, it was Plato that tended to think more deductively, and Aristotle that tended to think more inductively. Deduction is sort of hypothesis, although it often then means experimentation, to see if you can confirm the hypothesis. But it starts sort of with speculation and logic, and with regard to inductive reasoning and empirical evidence, which is what Aristotle really specialized in, it's not starting with some sort of conclusion. A hypothesis is a potential conclusion. It's not having a conclusion. It's getting interested in a subject, or being, employed to study something, and going out and gathering evidence, and then drawing conclusions after you've gathered the evidence. So Aristotle is sort of more in the realm of inductive method, experimental method, in Plato sort of more in the realm of sort of pure logic, pure abstract thought. Aristotle also contributed to ethics. All of these guys were concerned about the good life, human flourishing, as Aristotle himself put it, particularly in his great work, Nicomachean Ethics, which was named after his deceased child. And the doctrine of the mean is a key part of this. And I'll just read from the middle of the slide here. Aristotle thought there needed to be a better structure for people to understand how to follow virtues successfully. He identified corresponding vices to these virtues, and noted that for each virtue there's two vices, deficiencies and excesses. So the doctrine of the mean, is a way to say that sort of moderation, and you hear the phrase sometimes, moderation in all things, which has become a cliche, but it's fair enough to use it as a sort of a thumbnail sketch, or a way of sort of laying out Aristotle's contribution to ethics, or thinking on ethics. So the mean, right, the middle, is the virtuous path you see there in yellow. So that if you don't do enough of something, you don't have enough virtue. If you do too much of something, it's too much excess. So excess vice, deficiency vice. If the golden mean, as sometimes called, is followed, then you stay sort of moderate. Moderation in all things. So let's just pick a simple example: food. Right? If you don't eat enough, that's not good. If you eat too much, that's not so good. So a moderate amount, right, at the dinner table is the right path. Now he's talking about, of course, much more weighty issues than your diet, primarily here. Though he would probably agree that this is true. So the doctrine of the mean states that there's a balance between these two vices, and he called it the golden mean. The golden mean removes the negative aspects of each virtue to produce a pure form of this virtue, which leads on the right path towards basically enlightenment, the Greek word there. And it does say pure form, so there's still some element of thinking of sort of forms and kind of perfection and things being done, that there are right and wrong answers. There are certainties in thought and life. The big three, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, we've now looked at right in chronological order and their relationship to each other. All of them did believe in objective truths and went to great pains to try to demonstrate in their philosophy that there were objective truths, in sort of every subject in the world.